what you see before you is actually the title of our tribute to one of the great scholars of the industrial relations field. In fact, this title was the product of another great scholar in IR, John Budd. And so the title is riffing on, of course, Bruce's work in the delving into the history of our field. And now we are also honoring his own history of work. So it's a nice double meaning there. And just to put this into context, this would have, of course, happened in person here in Toronto. And we were really looking forward to welcoming everyone to this event. Of course, our speakers, which we'll introduce in a few moments, and of course, the guests. And there are still some thank yous, even though we're doing this virtually, for the event, for pulling this off. First and foremost, it goes to John Budd. There's a lot of Johns in the room, virtual room today. But John contacted me over a year ago with this thought in mind. Once kind of ILERA was being planned and hosted here in Toronto, we were thinking of doing something along these lines. And the second person I want to thank is Daphne Taras, who stepped up and was and still is the host of this year's ILERA/CIRA event here in Toronto, and made it also happen in the virtual space. And so I'm the third wheel, and I was putting the resources of the center behind this event too. We would have had, I think, a very nice dinner and an event, post-event, after this tribute. Unfortunately, you'll all have to eat by yourselves, but you can think of where we would have been and where we might be in some future date. We have an origin story here, and it's the origin of our feted guest, Bruce. So these are pictures of Bruce as a child. There's the rosebud picture. We know if the name, if we get the name of that that little wheelie, we'll have a clue into the insights of what's made Bruce who he is. But anyway, these are great photos. These were sent by Bruce to John, who's now put them together here for you in one visual. And they're lovely. They're great. And with this theme of history, we also have a double theme, which is, you know, Bruce has always made a point of integrating economic ideas into the industrial relations field and showing the connection between the two. And so here's an interesting one. We all heard about supply chains. So you have to look at this left to right to understand this supply chain. That's the stacks at the library. Okay, that's where Bruce starts. And then there's the second kind of Polaroid looking picture, kind of off to the bottom left. That's the back of his trunk. And then it all gets moved and shifted into the office where he works. And this is his home office. So I presume there's a similar cavalcade of books piled up in his office, although there are probably health and safety inspectors who come in and cause him to organize it a little more. But anyway, this was another great visual that was sent to us by Bruce, and then John kind of put it together. We know you work, and we know you read diligently. Your reference lists are sometimes longer than most people's papers. So now I know you actually read the stuff. Most of us just sort of go on to LexisNexis and look at the abstract. And of course, those are books that Bruce has used, but he's also written so much. And many of these books, this one here is really important for me. The brown cover, The Origins and Evolution of the Field, that helped me through my grad training. I came to industrial relations as a student not knowing very much, and this book helped ground me in what was being taught to me. Having crossed the street from the economics department here to the industrial relations, it was a longer distance than I thought, than that physical distance. So I'm sure these volumes have all been read by many of you. The one at the bottom is considerably 20 years on, What Do Unions Do? Bruce had a great piece in that volume. And yeah, we've benefited from both the historical lens and the theoretical lens and the empirical lens. It's sort of the blend of what industrial relations as a field was meant to be is embodied in the kind of books and research that Bruce has published over the years. I have just a funny quick story about that yellow book in the middle. I'm glad John put that in. I was a research assistant working on a piece in that volume. And I remember it was outsourced to me to deal with Bruce at the time, the revisions. And I got a taste of that then. And I still went back, and I've worked with Bruce since. So I knew he was diligent. I knew he read every piece that went into that volume that Daphne and Bruce edited on non-union employee representation. And the work was diligent, and it made the volume better because of that attention that Bruce paid to every submission that went into that volume.
So Rafael, that means you're a glutton for punishment.
I am. And look who I was a research assistant for Seymour Martin Lipset and Noah Meltz. And here was Bruce just like tearing into the piece, and I was dealt with the duty of fixing it up. So, but you made the piece better, and that's what matters, right? Because that's what people will read, 10, 15, 20, 30 years later. All right, on we move. So this is a nice little detail. We know the importance of the Wisconsin School to Industrial Relations, and there's a little cohort of our Wisconsin, what would we call them, the Wisconsin Mafia or something? They're attending here virtually. We mentioned some of the participants earlier, Morley, but Tom, who might have to leave the proceedings a little early, thought it might be a good idea if he could make a tribute on behalf of the Wisconsin School and Program with just a few words. So Tom, I can hand it over to you, and I'll mute myself.
Well, thank you, Rafael, and everyone who organized this wonderful occasion and tribute to Bruce. And I think I might guess who some of those people are in that picture, including the one that Bruce has written more about than any other scholar, and appropriately so. Bruce has really chronicled the life work of John R. Commons, and not just in a laudatory way, but in an analytical way that has informed all of us better than Commons ever could, because Commons was such a terrible writer that I'm not sure any of us could understand what he ever wrote himself. But Bruce makes good sense of Commons and the Wisconsin tradition. And that's a real tribute to you, Bruce, and something that I think I value particularly coming from that tradition, but I think every generation of PhD students that we have had from the 1970s to today reads your work, uses your book on the history of the field, and then we focus a bit on Commons as one of the fathers of industrial relations, certainly here in the United States. And so you really have carried on this Wisconsin tradition, the Wisconsin idea of using research to speak to really important problems. And I have enormous respect for what you have done and what you continue to do.
That was so beautiful and so generous. And I'm so proud to have you you're the bigger part of the Wisconsin tradition. And so I'm so proud to be a partner with you. And that what you said was it was moving. Thank you.
So we're going to move into the formal presentations. These are scholars in our field who have we didn't direct the scholars in any way. They looked through Bruce's career and his canon, and they picked pieces that they wanted to speak to. And as was mentioned at the beginning, we're going to give each person about 10 or 12 minutes to present their take on something Bruce has written.
So I'm going to talk about the Paradigms in Industrial Relations article that appeared in the BJIR 2008. The core argument, I think, will be familiar. It's one that Bruce has made on a number of occasions in different ways. So I'll briefly summarize the argument, but then raise a number of questions and issues about it. So the core argument runs, as set out in the article, along the following lines. The field of IR as we now know it, now understand it, was shaped, he argues, by two paradigms, what he calls the old and the modern industrial relations. The old industrial relations based, broadly speaking, on a study of the employment relationship. Modern industrial relations, which became much more prominent from the 1950s, based on a much narrower focus, a study of unions and collective bargaining, much less so on management. That being the case, it follows, so Bruce argues, that the decline of unions and collective bargaining across the advanced capitalist world and maybe elsewhere consequently threatens the viability of the modern industrial relations approach, the modern industrial relations paradigm. he concludes, therefore, that the field can only survive by reverting to a broader definition, if you like, the old industrial relations, through the inclusion of HRM. So let me say a few words about the old and the modern industrial relations as Bruce maps them out, and then raise some questions and issues. The old industrial relations, he argues, had a very broad focus comprising four main elements: professional progressive labor management, particularly centered around human relations, and we're talking now really about the 1920s, when the old IR emerged around the end of World War I. And in some ways, I think Bruce suggests that progressive or professional labor management was perhaps the key element in the old IR paradigm. The second element was labor law and social insurance. Third, trade unions and collective bargaining. And he suggests that unions and collective bargaining was perhaps particularly relevant in what he calls low road employers, employers using a business model based on cost minimization, labor cost minimization in particular. And finally, macroeconomic stabilization. In other words, states' policies, both federal and state, to generate higher levels of employment, maybe even full employment. So for Bruce, old industrial relations was rooted in actually an institutional analysis and design of systems of labor management cooperation. That was its key aim. As it turns out, mostly non-union, or at least old industrial relations seemed to take off and develop some traction, mainly in large non-union firms. He mentions Standard Oil, DuPont, International Harvester. He mentions Rockefeller and the Rockefeller Foundation in particular. He also makes the point that old industrial relations was, as it were, positioned against two major alternatives. One was neoclassical economics, and here he favors old industrial relations because, in contrast to neoclassical economics, it had a much more sophisticated view of the operation of market forces, recognizing that market forces actually were embedded in institutions and required institutions for their effectiveness. Is also against neoclassical economics because it lacks any credible model of conflict. In other words, it has a rather naive view of the operation and impact of market forces. Old industrial relations is also counterposed to revolutionary socialism, the notion, particularly in the light of the Russian Revolution, that conflict was inevitable, the capitalist system was dysfunctional, and ultimately a viable system of industrial relations required the elimination of the capitalist system in some form or other. Now, in contrast, modern industrial relations, which really developed in the 1930s and became ascendant and hegemonic, if you like, from the 1950s onwards, he says less about in the article because it's better known, but he argues it has 10 main attributes. I've separated these into assumptions and values. So the assumptions, and I'll run through these as quickly as Bruce ran through them, because they're all pretty familiar. Conflict is a central component of the employment relationship, whatever the prospects for cooperation between labor and capital. An imbalance of power is inherent in the employment relationship. Labor is not a commodity and can't be analyzed as a commodity. That is an assumption. It's also actually a value as well. And in fact, it's a value shared with old industrial relations. Fourth assumption, pluralism. There is a variety of stakeholders in the world of employment relations. Each of them both has a stake, has particular interests, and ought to be able to pursue those. So again, pluralism is both an assumption and a value. There are multiple theoretical approaches in the field of industrial relations because of its multidisciplinary character. That said, unions and collective bargaining are treated as central actors and processes. Again, that's both an assumption and a value. Industrial democracy is vital as a break and a counterbalance to autocracy. HRM and organizational behavior, those two fields of study and the underlying unitarist values they often subscribe to, should be treated as separate from the employment relations field. And finally, the modern industrial relations is very much pro-trade union. In other words, it favors trade unions as the most effective and appropriate method of regulating the employment relationship, the relations between labor and capital. So as I said, modern industrial relations emerged in the 1930s, dominant from the 1950s, but given the decline of unions and collective bargaining, it now calls into question the whole viability of our field. So that is a very brief summary of an argument. Bruce, of course, has written at much greater length about this, as many of you will know. But let me turn now to three questions. I actually framed them in the slides, problems and issues, but I suppose they're questions really. And as always with interesting arguments, I mean, they provoke a response, they provoke questions and issues, which I think is a good thing. None of us, I guess, likes to be criticized, but at least the articles prompted criticism and discussion. So that I treat as a positive. The first point I'd raise, first of three really, is a point about universality. Bruce, I think, actually evinces a degree of ambiguity as to how far his argument is primarily applicable to the US, Canada, one or two other liberal market economies, how far it is actually a universal argument. And if you look at the two indicators he employs, trade unions on the one hand, collective bargaining coverage on the other, actually you end up, I think, with rather different answers. Trade union decline, I think, is pretty much ubiquitous. I mean, leaving aside countries which, like China, where the statistics are probably, like the health statistics, totally unreliable, and so who knows what's happening there. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, grant Bruce's proposition that union decline is pretty much universal. The same is not true of collective bargain coverage, which actually has been maintained at pretty high levels across Western Europe and one or two other bits of Eastern Europe. So there is an ambiguity in the argument, therefore, and the question mark about how far it's a universal argument applicable across the entire capitalist world, how far it is an argument peculiar to the liberal market economies where collective bargaining coverage has shrunk along with union decline. Second point I make is to say that the equation of old IR as a broad paradigm, modern IR as a narrow paradigm, I think is really problematic. I can see why you would make the argument, but on the other hand, you could argue that old IR, as it emerged in the 1920s and 30s, actually is also quite narrow in some ways. It has a very weak analysis of conflict, a very weak analysis of power, and of course it's also rooted in a very conservative, unitarist, anti-union approach. And many of the practitioners of old industrial relations, the big corporations that Bruce mentions, were very hostile to the New Deal. So one could argue that actually that focus is really rather narrow in some respects. Modern industrial relations, conversely, you could argue actually is quite broad. For example, there are different theoretical approaches that dominate in different countries. So the sociology is prominent in the UK and France, legal studies, jurisprudence in Germany and Italy, the politics of welfare regimes, political science broadly, quite prevalent in Scandinavia. So actually modern industrial relations has taken a variety of forms across the advanced capitalist world and is not universally rooted in labor economics the way it is, I think, in the States. You could also argue that modern industrial relations is broad because it assigns quite a degree of centrality to the issue of power, which is one of the big and very heavily researched and analyzed topics in contemporary social theory, not just in the field of industrial relations. And finally, you could argue actually that both old IR and modern IR were actually quite broad in their simultaneous rejection of neoclassical economics. The third and final point I'll make, as I'm heading into my 11th minute, is that I think the proposal to broaden the employment relations field through the incorporation of HRM, I think a proposition Bruce has argued a number of times, actually has two, I think, different elements, and I think there may be some value in disentangling them. There's a theoretical focus and I think a value focus. Theoretically, I think Bruce is right to argue that the field of IR would be more, would be in a healthier state, more viable, if it were to expand its intellectual agenda and assumptions to include, for example, the study of management, corporate governance, etc. You don't, however, need to buy into the HRM agenda to do that. The varieties of capitalism approach, I think, has put the firm at the center of its analysis, the behavior of management, corporate governance, etc., the kinds of issues Bruce talks about are all central to the VOC approach. That is a way of broadening the employment relations field without buying into the agenda of HRM. Why is that a problem? Because I think, as Bruce himself says, a lot of HRM writers and certainly many practitioners also buy into unitarist assumptions of one kind or another, which I think are as I said in the slides, analytically flawed. I think pluralism is a much more viable, more useful framework for looking at employment relations, and normatively undesirable. Unitarism often ends up not just in welfare capitalism, as it were, benevolent employment relations, but also ends up in various forms of authoritarianism. So on that point, just some questions and issues raised by Bruce's extremely interesting, very well written and very well researched article. I will end, and my timer says it is exactly 12 minutes. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for participating in the late hours there, well, at least later than it would be here in England. And we're going to move next to my colleague Dionne.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to start by congratulating Bruce on an incredibly esteemed career. I think it can probably be said with almost no exaggeration that Bruce is one of the most productive scholars in industrial relations. And I went on Google, I can't even count the number of publications he actually has, but Google Scholar does tell me that he has almost 50 publications with 50 or more citations, which I think is just an incredible accomplishment given that no one in our field really cites anyone besides Bruce. But I figured probably many of those citations are actually coming from Bruce himself, citing himself. The first time I met Bruce was in 2006 when I was a first-year PhD student, and it was at the Canadian Industrial Relations Association conference where Bruce was scheduled to give the esteemed H.D. Woods lecture. And CIRA was being held in conjunction with the Congress of the Humanities and Social Sciences that year. And it was my first academic conference, and I really wanted to see an activist author that was scheduled to speak at a broader plenary session at Congress. And the plenary session unfortunately overlapped with Bruce's H.D. Woods lecture. And so I missed his lecture, not knowing what a major figure in the field he was in IR at the time. And in my defense, I was a first-year PhD student at a business school, and I was only scheduled to take my industrial relations courses in the following year. And so I really just didn't understand who Bruce was. In the second year, I was somewhat chagrined by finding out that he was probably on the syllabi like 10 times. But later that evening, this is the funny part of the story, I met up with my PhD supervisor and 2 other PhD students for a drink, and Bruce actually was with them. And he asked me what I thought about his talk, and I had to acknowledge and admit and apologize that I had missed it. The other 2 PhD students were more senior students, and they were at the Center for Industrial Relations at the University of Toronto, and they looked absolutely horrified that I would admit that I had missed his talk. But Bruce just smiled and asked if I would like the CD disc that he had with his presentation on it. And so he gave it to me, and I still have that disc, and I would absolutely love to have been able to hold it up to show you all, but unfortunately it's at my office at work and I'm currently at home. So I just wanted to tell that story because it sticks out in my mind as sort of the pivotal moment I met Bruce. So I was assigned a paper written by Bruce in 2010, published in ILR Review, titled Institutional Economics and the Minimum Wage, Broadening the Theoretical and Policy Debate. And there are so many fantastic passages in this paper, and every time I read it, I come away with some new insight that's relevant to the research that I'm conducting at the time, so this time was no different. So I'm going to try and do a really brief summary to do it justice, and then offer a few thoughts of my own on some of the conclusions that Bruce draws. So more ink has been spilled in the debate over legislative minimum wages than almost any other single specific labor policy or regulation. And Bruce briefly highlights the state of the minimum wage debate, though of course I'll note that in the decade since his paper was published, there have been some important empirical advances in this literature. But I think that his paper is still completely relevant to the debate today. He points out that the belief among many economists is that the battle is over whether the monopsony model or the model of the competitive labor market better characterizes low-wage labor markets. And that if we observe a negative effect empirically of the minimum wage on employment, it's evidence in favor of the competitive model, and if the effect is 0 or positive, the evidence supports a monopsony model. Today, I think that the debate has been slightly expanded empirically. There's a lot more technicality to the empirical literature and some advancements to the monopsony model, but I think his key point about these debates that I think still rage today is that they unnecessarily restrict the focus and framing. So he starts at a place in this paper, in a place that's near and dear to every industrial relations scholar's heart, with a very problem-centric question and approach. He basically explores what is the purpose of the minimum wage, and outlines rightly that even though the minimum wage is often framed in the popular literature as a poverty reduction tool, this rationale really sets it too easily up for critique, because it's fairly clear from a lot of the empirical literature that the minimum wage is a fairly blunt tool for poverty reduction, and it can actually have a negative impact on the lowest income workers, who are more likely to lose their jobs when the minimum wage increases. We've documented some of this in Canada, though we also note that many of the low income workers are actually young people who then suffer from less training early in their career. But he highlights that the initial goals of the minimum wage were, even though poverty reduction was seen possibly as being an indirect benefit, that the goals of the minimum wage were actually more directly related to a couple of things, as he outlines, were statements made in the FLSA. The legislation specifically highlighted other kinds of policy objectives. They were directly related to elimination of low labor standards that harm the ongoing efficiency, health, and well-being of workers. So very much an efficiency equity balance that we definitely are familiar with in our field. To prevent unrestrained competition from creating a race to the bottom among employers, to prevent low labor standards from interfering with attainment of full employment and sustainable economic growth, so very much a macroeconomic policy rationale, and also to reduce labor disputes and divisive relations between employers and employees, which can actually harm economic activity. And so Bruce then sort of sets up some of the key concepts and principles of institutional economics, where he draws on all of the classic people that we know and love, that he has actually introduced us to. And as Tom pointed out, rightly so, I don't think I would ever have read Commons and could have really understood Commons if Bruce hadn't distilled people like Commons and even the Webbs for me, and actually inspired me to go and read some of the original writings of some of these institutional economists. So I'm not going to go through those concepts and principles, and actually John highlighted some of them in his presentation, but he uses these principles from institutional economics to develop a positive case for minimum wage legislation. And he uses these principles to develop 4 rationales for minimum wage laws. These rationales include setting a floor on wages to offset imperfect competition and inequality of bargaining power, to promote macroeconomic stabilization and full employment, to contribute to long-term efficiency and growth, and to have employers fully incorporate labor market externalities and social costs of labor. And I think in addition to sort of these rationales that he develops, one of the most interesting insights of the institutional economics literature and scholarship, and what I would also argue is very much embedded in the industrial relations approach that Bruce highlights, is that even under conditions of perfect competition, minimum wage increases can actually increase economic efficiency. And so there's an economic efficiency rationale as well for the minimum wages. And arguably, I think this is probably the key insight and contribution of the early institutional economists and the field of industrial relations more broadly vis-a-vis economics, that even though there are trade-offs between efficiency and equity, promoting a focus on striking a balance between efficiency and equity can ultimately result in greater efficiency as well. That said, here's where I diverge from Bruce. And it's a bit of a stretch to say that I really even diverge from him, because while I agree with almost every statement he makes in this paper, and ultimately with his conclusion that most institutional economists believe a minimum wage is on balance a good policy, I'm probably one of the few industrial relations scholars, and I've gotten into a lot of debates at conferences over this. I have a complete adherence to the institutional economics principles, but I don't in general support a minimum wage, a legislative minimum wage. And I think I could use, and I'm not going to get into it in detail, but I could use almost all the same arguments Bruce makes in his paper and argue instead in favor of a basic income as a more effective policy response that would meet similar goals as the minimum wage. And I would argue a basic income would go one step further to help not only workers, but those that are excluded from the labor market. It would also do more as a direct poverty reduction tool. And ultimately, here's, I think, an argument Bruce misses. It would give workers more freedom and voice than a minimum wage, as they could say no to substandard market-based work altogether. And so as a result, I think the balance between efficiency, equity, and voice, which I know John Budd will love that I brought up, is actually, I think, critical. However, because I will give Bruce his credit, because the paper is so comprehensive, he even provides the caveat that a complete analysis of the minimum wage requires a comparative institutional analysis of the pros and cons of alternative policy instruments. And as he notes, institutionalists take a pragmatic position on the minimum wage and are very open to other options that meet the same ends. So he might counter with a quote from his paper to me that says, "What institutionalists do not countenance is doing nothing when a first best solution is unattainable, but an admittedly imperfect but helpful second best option is available." So I will give you that. If I didn't have a better option, I'm in favor of the minimum wage. My response would be to quote another passage in a footnote of your paper back to you, Bruce, that all theories are value laden because a theory depends on choice of assumptions and the factors given little versus much emphasis, both of which turn on underlying human preferences and values. So my only real critique of the paper, using that quote from your paper, is that I think too much emphasis is placed on the balance between efficiency and equity and not enough on another principle that institutional economists also espouse, that is the focus on worker voice. But that's a really small quibble. And in conclusion, probably the biggest compliment I can give you, Bruce, is that this is exactly the kind of paper I aspire to write one day. A focus on an important contemporary problem, a little bit of history and institutional background, a little bit of theory, a nod to the empirical evidence, a newly proposed way of conceptualizing mainstream assumptions while at the same time giving due credit to the people who have come before you and who you build upon, and a good dose of policy implications. I really think ultimately the perfect recipe for an outstanding contribution to the field of industrial relations.
Well, that was great. Thank you, Dionne. And without slides, that was very impressive. And I could see Bruce was diligently writing notes down. So be prepared, Dionne. That was a very deep reading of his work, and to use his own quotes to offer up a different conclusion, I thought was pretty clever. We're going to move on now. We're going to move to Australia, where Mark Bray has woken up very early. So we thanked our colleagues in the UK for staying up late. We should equally thank those that have woken up to be part of our session. So Mark, if you're ready.
Thank you very much for allowing me to participate. And I was going to begin by saying welcome to your future, because in fact it is tomorrow for most of you. At this moment, it's about 8 o'clock in the morning in Australia. I've been asked to talk about a paper of Bruce's from 2010 as well, about the theoretical foundations of industrial relations. I felt forced to begin with a confession because unlike Rafael's introduction, I hadn't read this paper before we started. And I think part of the reason why I didn't, at least lies with Bruce. If he didn't publish and write quite so much, it may be a little easier for mere mortals like us to keep up with him. And it's also an article that's remarkably long, and the argument is really quite complex. So it requires a bit of commitment to work all the way through. So Bruce, you're part of the reason why I hadn't read it earlier.
Okay, I just have to interject that it was Jack Fiorito who is in this session. He was the editor at ILERA, and he went beyond the call of duty to let me keep adding. So it's really his fault.
Indeed, blame needs to be attributed, I think.
Just note, I was trying to find ways to reject those papers, Bruce. I just couldn't.
When you do read the paper, it is, of course, incredibly rewarding. It's got a very tight and elegant argument in it. It draws on a range of very diverse and seminal pieces, both historical and contemporary. And honestly, the insights and the thoughts that it provokes throughout are gems throughout. So it really is a fine example of scholarship, I think, and completely consistent with Bruce's reputation as a scholar of historic renown. In terms of the argument of the paper itself, it aims to explore the theoretical foundations of industrial relations, firstly by contrasting it with the neoclassical labour economics approach and human resource management, and also by drawing on that historical heritage of industrial relations scholarship, of which he's so familiar. A lot of that is American, but he goes beyond it as well. And it seems to me this is an incredibly ambitious task, and I'm surprised by that really, given that Bruce takes these things on a regular basis. I think it's also an incredibly desirable task as well, and one that I'm particularly interested in, because it's really about trying to articulate what's unique about employment relations, industrial relations, and how it's distinguished from other theoretical approaches. And that's really where I want to focus a lot of my comments. Throughout the article, Bruce uses this rhetorical device that's contained in this figure here from page 83 of the paper. It's got three components. The first one on the left there is his symbol, if you like, of the neoclassical economics approach to analysing the labour market, which he, I think, very effectively demolishes, and does so with a passion, an outrage in many cases that I completely share. The second in the middle is the triangle, which is his symbol of the firm. And again, a lot of the discussion on those pages of the article is about the failures of the neoclassical economics analysis of the firm, and also the human resource management analysis of the internal dynamics of the firm. And then the third is really the symbol of where he's hoping to take us. And it's a picture from 1915 of John Rockefeller with also an employee of his as a coal miner and an industrial relations consultant, I gather, as a Canadian, William Lloyd Mackenzie King. And he sees this as a symbol of the unique value add of industrial relations and its potential. So, and this device that he uses really runs through the whole article, and I think is an incredibly important part of the elegance of the argument he develops. Focusing in on that, the real core that I'm most interested in is what are the theoretical foundations of industrial relations, and how do they vary from neoclassical labour economics and human resource management. His argument is that industrial relations has got a subject domain, which he calls the employment relationship. That's fairly unremarkable, I guess. But then he focuses on the two main components of the employment relationship, which he sees as being the labour market and the firm. And what he's suggesting is that both of these have got fundamental labour problems. The labour market is really the labour problem of how to develop an effective price for labour in the market. And within the firm, it's a matter of how to balance competition and cooperation for the mutual gain of both management and employees. And what he's suggesting is that the industrial relations distinctive analysis of these two areas and the solutions to the labour problems that he's suggesting are different for industrial relations versus both neoclassical labour economics and human resource management. So most of what Bruce has got to say here is a relative argument. It's kind of, a lot of it is about what industrial relations or employment relations is not. It's also how industrial relations, employment relations differs and ultimately is better than neoclassical labour economics and human resource management. And who could dispute that amongst us? But I guess where I start to ask, what is the universal here rather than the relative? What's the unique and value-added part of the employment relations approach? Well, Bruce comes back to this at the end of the article when he quotes Samuelson, who says that it takes a theory to kill a theory. And he then goes on and tries to summarise what he sees as the key components of an employment relations approach, which are fourfold: a subject domain, which we've already talked about, a corpus of theory, which is, I think the kernels are there, but I'm not completely convinced that they've been developed completely in the article. Then he argues that it should have a welfare function and also a method. And it seems to me this discussion at the end of the paper is more a promise of a more general theory of employment relations that's to come. There's not as much detailed account of what that employment relations approach really is, to really serve the purpose that I was hoping that he would pursue. And he points at this in the very last line of the article, where he says that the contribution that I've tried to make is to point the way forward. So it seems to me that he's got a promise there of what's to come. Well, what was the impact of the article? Well, I had a good look at a number of the more relevant 158 citations that are identified on Google Scholar. And certainly what you find is that they're nearly all from very high quality journals. And there's almost a complete acceptance and agreement with the critique that he develops of neoclassical labour economics and human resource management. And this, I think, is a sign of the reverence with which Bruce's work is held. He really is the go-to guy when it comes to this sort of historical and paradigmatic analysis of industrial relations and especially neoclassical labour economics. A number of others have used this article in particular and his other work as a launching pad to develop, I guess, what I'd call more middle range theories. But they do this without really engaging closely in the more general arguments that Bruce is trying to point towards. So there's work on social movement theory and unions, corporate social responsibility, unions and high involvement work practices, just to name a few. These middle range theoretical developments that sort of use Bruce's work as a launching pad. But unfortunately, it seems to me that few have really accepted the challenge and certainly not realised the promise of articulating what the general and distinctive employment relations approach is. And that's really what I'm most interested in. What is it? And I find this failure of subsequent scholars, and me included, and maybe I've got it wrong, I'm not sure, but it seems to me that this is something that deserves a lot more attention from Bruce's work than it's got. But I've also got to acknowledge that it's a tough gig. It's really very difficult you've got to ask whether this is a possible exercise. And in raising that possibility, I thought I'd just explore a little bit beyond the sort of more economic and human resource management focus of Bruce's critique, because this whole issue of whether it's possible to develop an institutional analysis has been discussed elsewhere as well, in the sociological, political, economy, comparative politics sort of area. And I just thought I'd run past a couple of early quotations. March and Olson, for example, if you read through that quote, are really suggesting that the institutionalists everywhere tend to be stronger on their critique of other people's approach rather than developing a coherent set of theories to explain what the institutionalist approach is. Thielen and Steinmo in an earlier paper make a very similar point. And I wonder whether one of the reasons why we've had problems developing a really coherent account of what's unique about employment relations, particularly from an institutionalist point of view, is that this is a tough, difficult thing to do. Anyway, by way of conclusion, it seems to me this article is, the scholarship in it is exemplary. The critique of neoclassical economics in it is incredibly convincing and I find very satisfying. And I share an awful lot of the outrage that Bruce reveals in the article about especially that neoclassical approach. The critique of HRM is pretty compelling. And the comparison between those two disciplines and the employment relations approach is well articulated and intuitively really appealing. So it seems to me that the paper that Bruce has given us here is a really good start on grappling with the big issue of how we develop a more institutionalist analysis that we can call the employment relations approach. And I think for his contribution to doing that, we should all be incredibly grateful. So thank you, Bruce.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was excellent. Thank you for that dive into another very deep paper with a lot of tentacles reaching across disciplines and into the past, but also to the future of our own. Well, I want to move on now. I can't thank David for waking up early or staying up late. He's out in the West Coast, but I want to thank him nonetheless for agreeing to do this for us.
When I joined the Columbia Business School faculty a long time ago, one of my colleagues was Neil W. Chamberlain, a name who was, I think, as famous in his day as Bruce is today. And after spending a decade or more at the school, Neil was getting close to retirement, and two of my colleagues, James W. Kuhn, Chamberlain and Kuhn Collective Bargaining, and Paul McNulty, maybe less known to you, a very good economic historian. And I thought it would be a useful thing to try to do something like we're doing here today for Bruce, to sort of assess Neil's work and document what we thought his contribution was to the field. So we wrote a paper, or a manuscript, and we submitted it to Industrial Relations, the journal that Bruce's article that I'm going to comment on in a moment appeared in 2010. In Industrial Relations, the editors wrote back and said, well, they didn't give us comments, interestingly enough. They said, this doesn't fit the focus, the scope of our journal. We said, okay, we sent it off to Industrial and Labor Relations Review. I think maybe Don Cullen was the editor at the time. I might be wrong about that. And after a few weeks, they sent it back. They didn't comment either, except to say, this is not the type of thing we do, and if we did it, we would wait until the individual had passed on before we would document his contributions. And we said, really? Do they mean after he's dead? And we concluded that's what they meant. We sent it off to the British Journal of Industrial Relations, and wouldn't you know, they published it in 1983. It's an article called Neil W. Chamberlain, a retrospective analysis of his scholarly work and influence. Well, I'm very pleased to say that we don't have to wait till Bruce passes on to have this session featuring his work and acknowledging his work. And I want to comment in particular on his 2010 article. Now, I think this is the third consecutive 2010 article that we're commenting on. So Bruce, maybe that was your peak year, but knowing you, it probably wasn't. And the article in particular is titled SHRM, Strategic Human Resource Management Theory in the Post-UCLA Era, why is it fundamentally misspecified? This piece appeared in 2010, in volume 49 of the Berkeley Journal of Industrial Relations. I have a few things to say about this article and a few more things to say about the larger context within which I would like to place this article. The key takeaway point or learning point of this article is this. HR practices or human resource management practices should be treated as a left-hand side variable, a dependent variable, rather than, as Mark UCLA does, and almost everybody else who is in this area does, specifies it and measures it as a right-hand side variable. That is the essence of this piece. And that conclusion, in my opinion, stands the test of time a decade later. I concur with it, and I've seen nothing published anywhere since, including in the Academy of Management Journal, where Mark UCLA first published his piece in 1995 that Bruce critiques. And so if you buy that line of reasoning, company financial performance, which are the left-hand side variables in UCLA's work and many others, revenue growth, return on capital investment, and the like, should actually be placed on the right-hand side of an estimating equation. So the causality switches around. Now, knowing Bruce as well as we do, it takes him 27 pages to say this. And he has, by my count, 17 different acronyms in this article, including, by way of examples, HPWP, HPWS, WC, SC, BF, BP, and the list goes on. And if you want to know what those acronyms stand for, you're going to have to read this article very closely. I think that is the fundamental point that Bruce makes, and it's a really important point. But rather than spend the rest of my time going into the related details of that article, I want to step back a little bit and ask the question, or address the question, why did IR, or the field we are in, somehow become involved in HRM studies? And my explanation of it goes something like this. For several decades, one of the leading topics in our field was the attempt to measure the impacts of unions on wages. That occupied the attention of scholars all over the world. H. Greg Lewis at Chicago made an entire career of measuring these impacts. And basically speaking, a lot of theoretical and empirical literature emerged emphasizing the measurement of different unions' impacts on wages in different industries. All of that literature had a common theoretical structure, of course, which was classical price theory, microeconomic price theory. And so union wage impact research dominated the field. Now, in 1982, Tom Peters and Bob Waterman, who were working at McKinsey & Company in San Francisco, Waterman was the managing partner. Peters was a few years removed from getting his PhD at Cornell, I think from the ILR school in organization studies. They published a book titled In Search of Excellence, Lessons from America's Best Run Companies. That book sold 25 million copies worldwide in its first 2 years, was published in 14 languages, spent a year and a half on the New York Times bestseller list, was the first book about management ever to do so. And in that book, Peters and Waterman claimed that the way top performing companies became top performing and that differentiated them from the other companies in their supposed data set was by the way they managed their people, quote unquote. Their top performing companies were the 20 publicly traded companies on the New York Stock Exchange, measured by their growth in stock price between 1960 and 1980. The other companies were some 1,410, I think, that fell below that in terms of stock price growth. Why am I mentioning this book to you? It's because, in my opinion, given its huge impact on companies and societies, and in some countries, public policy, it threw down a gauntlet to people interested in research to try to actually measure the effects of human resource management practices on company financial performance. Up to that time, the only impact research that I'm aware of was the union impact on wages. Now, Neil Chamberlain wrote a great book on the union impact on management control in 1948, I think, but most of the field was focused on the union impact on wages. Interestingly, in the 1970s and 80s, the union impact on wages literature expanded in depth and breadth and began to look at the union impact on benefits, on R&D expenditures, on capital investment, and ultimately profitability. And the results of that research was there was a positive sign on wages and benefits, negative signs on capital investment, R&D, and profitability. And that helped us to understand why unionism began to decline. Companies sought to escape unionism to avoid this negative profit impact. But in the meantime, researchers started to take a look at these human resource management practices and build indices of them so that they could use HRM as a right-hand side variable, like unionization, and company performance as a left-hand side variable. Mark Uselid was not the first person to do that. John Delaney, who's with us today, and Casey Ichniowski, who unfortunately passed away several years ago, and I did a survey in the late 1980s sponsored by the Department of Labor of the human resource management practices of a sample of 420 United States companies. And the DOL published that the results of that survey in a monograph called Human Resource Policies and Practices in American Firms. It provided basic data to begin to build an index of human resource management practices, the kind of high involvement index or indices that UCLA features in his work, and scores of other authors do as well. And in 1990, Dan Mitchell and Ed Lawler at USC and I gave a presentation at a conference in Washington on paying for productivity, a look at the evidence, which became the title of a book edited by Alan Blinder. And we measured the effects of non-financial performance and financial performance, non-financial participation and non-financial participation of employees separately on company ROI and return on investment. So these were predecessors to the work that UCLA and others did, and Mark's first piece emerged in 1995, which is what Bruce focuses on in his excellent critique and his claim that UCLA misspecifies the causal relationships, which, as I say, I think has endured the test of time. Now, there are a couple of other things that I would like to say about this in particular. If you buy the argument or the claim that company financial performance has effects on the type of human resource practices, and you buy the claim that human resource practices have some effect on company financial performance, you would have to use something approaching a two-stage least squares type of analysis. Bruce doesn't do that. UCLA certainly doesn't do that. Adam Litwin, who is on our Zoom session today, I think, wrote a piece in 2013 in the same journal that Bruce published his piece in, Industrial Relations, called Not Feather Bedding, but Feathering the Nest, HRM and Investments in Information Technology. He didn't look at financial performance. He looked at the extent to which HRM practices, particularly of the high involvement type, influenced a company's adoption of technological change. And he used a two-stage least square analysis, putting HRM on the right-hand side in one specification and on the left-hand side in another. So there's a very good example of the type of analysis that I think has been very much lacking in this HR business performance literature. I'd like to make one final point in the time that I have with you about this, and it's something that UCLA doesn't deal with, Bruce doesn't deal with. He knows about it. He and I have discussed this many times. I don't deal with it, and to the best of my knowledge, others in the field don't either, and it's this. It's an omitted variables problem. You could call it misspecification, but it's omission. I've taught in business schools my entire career, somewhat by accident. So I bump up against marketing people, finance people, operations people. They all have their journals, their literatures, and they all have subsets of scholars who say certain marketing practices around customer relationship management, customer engagement, branding, and so forth are associated with greater financial performance, improved revenue, improved capital, return on capital investment. Finance folks say certain practices around financial management, debt to equity ratios, diversification of a portfolio are associated with superior financial performance. And operations people, who basically use the optimization principle that's kind of equivalent to the maximization principle in economics, say that if you optimize the way you manage your supply chain, you're going to enhance your financial performance, bottom line financial performance. Here are at least three other areas of substantial scholarship that's become, like our field, more quantitative, deeper, and more siloed. And none of the work in our field that I'm aware of tries to specify variables on marketing practices, financial management practices, and operations management practices, and put them in estimating equations with human resource management practices, whether you treat them as right-hand side or left-hand side variables. I'm motivated to say this all because of the excellence of Bruce's work, clearly, and I want to make the point about how much his work has caused me, and I think many, many others, to think more deeply and hopefully broadly about what the work in our field represents. So that's what I have to say about Bruce's 2010 article in Industrial Relations.
Thank you so much, David. And again, thank you for that expansive view and the detail and time you took to put those arguments together. Those are important. We'll have time for a few questions at the end that we'll pull together. But we'll give, of course, Bruce time to have his say as to all of your presentations. But we have one last presentation, and that's Daphne. If we had baseball, we'd be saying you're batting cleanup, which is actually one of the most important roles. It brings all the runs in, shall we say. So Daphne, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, so I like to think that I'm the closer on this panel, and I knew I would be the closer when I begged my co-organizers to let me do this. In the midst of writing, I'm just turning my timer on. Okay, in the midst of writing and editing a massive yellow tome on the subject of non-union representation, behind my back in 1999, Bruce riffed off a Yale Law and Policy Review article of some 84 pages called "Does the National Labor Relations Act Constrain Employee Involvement and Participation Programs in Non-Union Companies?" I have 7 thoughts. They are not about the significance of the article. They are about Bruce and Bruce's style. First, why did I choose this particular article in all the body of scholarship? You're wondering why I went back in time. You're wondering why I wasn't one of the 2010 people. I chose it because, aside from the self-indulgence of allowing me a trip down memory lane, at a time that Bruce and I thought we were writing enough together that we would emerge as Sidney and Beatrice Webb, I chose that article because it has characteristics that are quintessentially Bruce Kaufman. It is long, it is expansive, it is thorough. The Kaufman style, first of all, is to be comprehensive. Second, and part of the Kaufman ethos, it tries to make a difference. By tackling, in this case, a piece of legislation and suggesting change, it was written for the practical purpose of briefing policymakers on all angles of the problem and gently guiding them towards a solution. The gentle prodding is difficult to discern because after 80-some pages, one forgets where one's prodded, but nevertheless, it ends with some very practical thoughts. Now, with today's imperatives weighing on us, it seems like a very small concern, the topic of Section 882 in the National Labor Relations Act. But at the time, it was very topical. It was very significant. It was the epicenter of a major debate in the United States. And we thought, Bruce thought, that the article would jettison him to Congress, to hearings, to the center of policy reform. I remember Bruce bought a lot of she clothes in prep for, sadly, the call that never came. But I could see by reading that article, Bruce was prepping himself to make a major contribution to policy development, much like John Commons. Third, let's face the fact that Kaufman is an economist, and let's just put it right out there. Nevertheless, how many economists would write in a law journal where just the assembly of footnotes can become a year's work? There is little economic about the article. Like John Commons, like William Lyon Mackenzie King, Bruce actually spent a lot of time in the article stepping out of his office to find 6 clear case studies of non-union plans. He interviewed practitioners all over the United States. He tried to engage with the very pressures that face union and management at the workplace. The article is thick with insights. Bruce is unafraid of field research and does it himself. This is a singly authored article that does not owe the field research to graduate students. This is Bruce getting on planes, trains, and automobiles to get out there and find out more about the phenomenon. I really admire that. Fourth, it throws in the kitchen sink, plus the kitchen, plus the house, plus the land on which the house sits. To discuss any phenomenon, Bruce has to provide context. It's really part of Bruce revving himself up to write. And so it's not just retrospection. Bruce reads and quotes the scholars and practitioners of their day from the turn of the last century to today. He takes all the readers on basically a feature-length documentary with a very large cast of characters who populate Bruce's unique world. So these cast of characters are familiar to us: John Commons, Mackenzie King. I'll also add Cyrus Chang, William Leeserson, to name the top contenders that appear repeatedly in Bruce's genre of work. To keep up with Bruce, I spent fortunes acquiring very old books on Abe books. Books that are rare, books that are unread, books that are unloved. Bruce pores over them. He finds meaning in every word. In order to understand Bruce's contribution, you have to understand that Bruce is a word hoarder. And you saw pictures of his office. He finds meaning in other people's words, and they resonate in his brain. Fifth, Bruce looks at phenomena from all angles. He's not that ideologically driven. He's driven by a kind of curiosity. So if non-union representation is a large raw diamond, let's say it's a diamond of 500 carats, he spends years examining the stone. He turns it on all angles. He looks for clean cuts. He then starts grinding. He then taps, looking for the fault line. And then he exposes all the facets to light. So it's very characteristic of Bruce's work that he flips on you from one perspective to another perspective to another perspective. And this is, in fact, where Bruce and I had the most difficulty with studying non-union representation, because, as Bruce often says, quoting the aforementioned William Leeserson, almost anything that may be said about employee representation will be true. And that's very much almost anything that's said about labor relations will be true. But Bruce holds it up and turns it so that you see all facets. Sixth, the trick to co-authoring with Kaufman is to situate any argument and advocate for that argument by using the words of one of the previous century's greats. Whether the words are in the preface, whether they motivate the whole thing, or whether they're on page 231, Bruce will find the words. It's imperative to ground any argument in someone else's thoughts, and then Bruce plants the seed and allows it to bloom into a larger argument. And I think that's what gets Bruce's intellectual juices flowing. This is how the Kaufman style works. Finally, seventh, there's the notion of value added. And for those of us who have been Kaufmanized in the review process, I don't know how many of us have heard, where's the value add? What have you done that's different? Why didn't you do more than you already did? Kaufman's work always has value add. If you're able to follow the context, the path with the great quotes, the historic reference, and take the entire journey forward. And I think that's what all of our commentators today have done. They've taken journeys forward in articles. You end up with the insight that actually motivated the entire article. I think David Lewin just did that. That's the insight that motivated the article, and then you take the journey. And so the value added is there in this Yale article. It is actually a series of policy recommendations. By the time you get to the policy recommendations, you have a deep understanding of the field in which he's situating those policy recommendations. So I just wanted to do some work on diagnosing the Kaufman style because I've worked with him for so long. I want to end by saying something very sincerely to Bruce, and I'm just looking at him. My life, my academic career have been immeasurably enriched by my association with Bruce. And it's not just the publishing part, it's the discoveries, it's the attending the opening the Colorado Fuel and Iron archives, it's the tenacity of working and not giving up to the point of total exhaustion. It's the sheer concentration of effort that it takes to work with Bruce, to work with the intensity that Bruce works, withstanding the Kaufmanization of being critiqued by Bruce. And I want to say he's the most demanding of scholars, both for himself and for the people around him. And he has never never lost his love of industrial relations. There are a lot of scholars that as they get older, they disengage from the review process because it's so brutal. But Bruce intensified his ability to put work into the review process and engage at the very top levels of scholarship. That makes him totally unique among scholars. And he will never give up on industrial relations. And for that reason, and for so many others, I will never lose my love of Bruce Kaufman. And in future, it will be the highest praise for future scholars if people say, "Are you from the Kaufman School of Labor Relations?" And I wish we could capture it and say, these are the distinctive features of the Kaufman School. So thank you, Bruce. I've loved every minute of working with you, except for the few where I didn't.
What a great tribute. Thank you. And you definitely batted cleanup there, Daphne. Okay, to use the baseball metaphor. That was excellent. Mindful of time, I mean, this is being recorded, and there will hopefully be some editing, given we had some technical problems at the beginning. We obviously have to have time for Bruce to have his say. I just wanted to, before Bruce speaks, recap, I think, 4 comments, okay, that appeared in the chat, and then Bruce, you're going to take over. First one was a question by Alex Bryson, who mentioned when Dionne was speaking about your minimum wage paper, what your thoughts were on statutory interventions in labor markets and what function they have. Do they act as complements, more as complements, or more as substitutes to trade unions and labor relations? The other question was by Daphne, which was Bruce's view of the living wage, especially in light of COVID. There was a question by Russell Lansbury, who mentioned that in your volume, Global Evolution of IR, 400 pages were devoted to Western democracies, but only 50 to Asia, Africa, Latin America. Are we still too Western-centric in our scholarship in IR, ER? And then lastly, Alex Bryson made another comment. There was an interchange with David Lewin about maybe the barriers are finally breaking down between many of the fields. There are data sets that have these employee-employer match data sets that give you a plethora of variables that used to be very difficult to uncover. And maybe we're in a time and place where we can begin to look to other fields more broadly. And given the industrial relations well placed in that respect, it might be the one field that can integrate all the others. So with that in mind, those are just some background questions I wanted to put on the table. We're going to hand it over to you, Bruce. And we will be mindful of time and we can mute you. But that's no threats. We don't want to use just sticks. We're looking for your comments now, Bruce.
Okay, thank you, Rafael. And Rafael's been on the receiving end of my constructive comments, and the fact that you're here, Rafael, and have a big smile, I really appreciate. And to everyone that I've given constructive comments, hey, I'm sorry. Wherever I went overboard, forgive me. All right. You know, all of you, John and Mark, Daphne and David, really, everyone was beautiful what you said, and I appreciate it so much. And really knocked it out of the park. And I have to say, as a personal reflection, that I owe it both to my sisters. Anything I've accomplished, I owe to my sisters, because a therapist told me, he said, Bruce, you will never, never stop writing and working, because my 2 sisters, we grew up in this little Iowa farm town, and we were all desperate to get out. And my 2 sisters ended up both singing opera in Europe. And my older sister became rather famous. And so my therapist said, Bruce, and so when I was growing up, of course, my mom and dad were very musical. And my dad would sing at weddings and all this sort of stuff. And we all sang in the church choir. But of course, I couldn't sing a note. And my two sisters glommed onto all the attention growing up, and they were the apples of the parents' eyes. So ever since, here I am at age 72, still staying up all night to work on my next article. And if it just wasn't for my two musical sisters, you know, I'd probably play golf or something. So I owe it to them. And also, my wife just left the room, Dionne, but, you know, I did have 3 articles in 2010, and there is a cost to that. And so I need to recognize that. And in a certain way, I'm selfish. And you know what? This has nothing to do with the fact we were having this session today, but yesterday, I was reading something written in the early 1910s about the Wisconsin idea. And I find it quite moving, the Wisconsin idea. And it is about making the university the servant of the people, the servant of society. And I find this idea, as I've said, I find it moving, and I find it seriously lacking in our modern university, where I see many of us, and myself included, as becoming self-interested publisher monks. You know, we're interested in our reputations, and we're interested in going to conferences, and, you know, people read our stuff, et cetera, et cetera. But what contribution does it make to society? And, you know, I've spent the last 6-8 years mostly in HRM. And those people drive me crazy, because it seems more than most academic fields that it's simply a publishing game, and there's really not too much real world behind it. And so what? I mean, they have written 8,000 articles trying to show that HRM practices impact firm performance. Okay, let's just say it does. So what? And the only so what is it burnishes their reputation, you know, instead of being personnel, now you're big power HRM. Well, great. Anyway, so with the Wisconsin idea, we try to use our research to make a difference in society. And I have always been attracted to industrial relations for that reason. And well, anyway, last night I was reading this thing out of the 1910s, and it quotes Thomas Chamberlain, who I'd never heard of, but he was a president of the University of Wisconsin, but in the 1890s. And I wrote down this. I'm saying, Daphne, I have to smile at what you said. Somewhere I'm going to work this into, you know, a 50-page article to quote him, but here it is. Scholarship for the sake of the scholar is simply refined selfishness. Scholarship for the sake of the state and the people is refined patriotism. And so I'm going to guess that this resonates with many people today, that our sense of community, our sense of trying to have some social cohesion and do something progressive is going down the drain. And so I see it in the academic world where, you know, it's a paper chase, it's a rankings chase, blah, blah, blah. And so my thought, and then I will have used up my time, is that it is a total blessing that each one of us has gotten to be an academic, has gotten to be a professor, has gotten to use our life in one of the most challenging, interesting endeavors that there is out there. I mean, how do we get so lucky? But we're also given a chance to make a difference. And I can't claim I've made a difference. I've had a lot of fun, and I've really been intellectually stimulated by this stuff. So I guess I have to say I really appreciate what you've all said, and I definitely put a lot of hours into this, and my wife has paid a sacrifice, because when I write 3 articles in 2010, that's less time with her. And so I'm turning that down right now. Anyway, I appreciate everything everybody said, and my remarks are to inspire us all to try to keep our social mission in line and not get caught up in this publish or perish, which is destroying our academic world. But we do need to write for the benefit of Fran Benson, who I see in my square there. Okay, thank you so much.
Wow. Well, that was excellent. And yes, we're all clapping, Bruce, and not metaphorically, really clapping for that. That was touching and inspiring. And, you know, just to say a few final words here, again, I did thank those that organized this event at the beginning, but John Budd in particular deserves a lot of credit. He kept the thread going throughout, as I said, a year and a half's worth of planning, and didn't fail even when we knew the conference wouldn't happen in person. What's the new word? Everyone knows it. Starts with a P. He pivoted very quickly and managed to rally us here. And it's actually quite nice because I think more people attended virtually than might have been in one place here in Toronto. Which if you were going to be realistic about it, we probably managed to bring in more people here. That's, I think, a great thing about the virtual event.
Hey, Rafael, I need to jump in there because
please. Yeah.
I forgot to give John Budd the recognition and my thanks that he deserves, because I mean, he really went out of his way to organize this. And John, I appreciate it so much. You are such a generous person. You know, I mean, John, I talked him into hosting this innovative teaching conference. And that was a huge amount of work. And so, you know, I've done more to hold back John's career than to promote it. So you're really big-hearted to put this on, John. And you are, you know, when I speak about academics becoming self-interested and so on, you are the exact opposite. I mean, you are such a communitarian type person for our field. And so thank you for organizing this. And you're a terrific scholar.
Thanks, Bruce. That means a lot, and it's enough just to have balancing efficiency, equity, and voice right behind your head. And you can see you've moved all of us. I can't even remember the name of my own book anymore. But thanks. And like Rafael said, it's, you know, we're missing the camaraderie in person, and, you know, a nice meal and all of that. But yeah, it's really been great to be able to have people who wouldn't have been able to travel to Toronto, and really appreciate the presenters and all their work, and everybody who stayed up late and woke up early for 5 different time zones to be here tonight.
Great. I have one more formal slide because John put a lot of effort into this. So I'm going to share a slide with you, the last slide, but then we'll carry on in an informal way. This is a word cloud that John Budd created from the articles that were listed today, the body of Bruce's work, this picture, which I think is expansive and summarizes not just Bruce's work, but, you know, many of the work that we've done in this field. So I thought that was very nice. So now we can end the proceedings. So we have a thank you to Bruce, of course.
If I could butt in, I'm sorry, this is Julie Hotchkiss, and I don't know hardly any of you. I am not in the industrial relations field, but everything I know about it has come from co-authoring or Bruce being so generous as to allow me to be a co-author on his textbook for a couple of the last editions. And it really, he started a good thing and was getting burnt out, and I was able to jump on and help let that continue for a few years. And I just want to say, Bruce, that I really, really cherish that time working with you. I learned a lot. And I also have to say that the first thing I did when I came on board was create an outline for the chapters, because there was a lot of stuff in there, but as it was more of a flow of thought, as you have all attested to Bruce's way of thinking. So that was my my very minor contribution to that work. So thank you, Bruce. I think this has been very touching to see all of how high a regard you're held by these folks.
You know, it's a heresy to say, but I think that qualifies as the birth picture of industrial relations. And that's heresy because that's John D. Rockefeller Jr., who is not usually thought of as a pillar of industrial relations. And that's Mackenzie King in the middle and Archie Dennison on the left. So that's labor on the left, capital on the right, and Mackenzie King as the force, industrial relations.
Impartial umpire, the impartial umpire.
And of course, I'm going to stop here in 10 seconds, but Mackenzie King and Rockefeller started the non-union representation plans pretty much in the States and in Canada, so that's where Daphne and I got our start.
Alex has a glass of wine and I was quite jealous. I think
unfortunately I've just finished it, so I'm off to the fridge in a minute to find a white something. But it is 11:30 in England.
Thank you, Dionne. Thank you, Jen. John, thank you. Alex, thanks. Raphael, Russell. All right. Long live industrial relations.